just to shed some light on the previous discussions we've had. So previously we've examined the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We've examined why we need religion, the attributes of God. We've examined prophethood, the multiple dimensions of prophethood, the role of prophets, their infallibility, their knowledge. We also examined the Imams of Ahlul Bayt and their role. Then we ended the Imamah discussion by addressing Al-Imam Al-Mahdi, Ajjalallahu ta'ala farajah. Why is he in occultation? We examined the signs of reappearance. We also examined briefly the end of time and some of the signs of the end of time. And we did that last year. This year we started with the discussion of taqleed, following scholars and what the basis for that is. Then basically we ended that discussion by examining the shrines, and especially the money that is spent to decorate the shrines and the golden domes, for instance. Is this a waste of money and resources or not? We've had that discussion. Before we continue to the last part of our course, which has to do with the soul, death, dying, barzakh, and the Day of Judgment, there's one important aspect of our school of thought which is highly misunderstood, and it demands that we analyze it academically. It is something that you constantly hear from other Muslims, from other schools of thought, critiquing, attacking us for, misunderstanding. So it's important to have this discussion in a few sessions before we continue with the discussion on the soul, death, and the Day of Judgment. Now, this is a very sensitive aspect of our school of thought, and we will examine it in 3 stages. This discussion is the discussion of temporary marriage. In Arabic, it's called Zawaj al-Mu'aqqat. It's also known as the Mut'ah marriage, or you find some in the media translating it as the pleasure marriages. And so it's something that's highly misunderstood about our school of thought, which demands our analysis. We'll examine this in 3 stages. Number 1, we'll have the rational discussion, the intellectual discussion about it. Number 2, we'll examine temporary marriage from Sunni hadith. What is found in Sunni books? What's the history of it? Did it exist at the time of the Prophet? How did it later get banned? We'll examine that. Then finally, we'll end by looking at our school of thought and examining its conditions. What are its conditions? What are the legal details surrounding it? And then we'll examine some aspects about it that people find troubling, the way it's abused, for instance, or some of the negative consequences that can arise from it. So tonight, we will examine the first aspect, which is the rational, moral discussion. The argument is, the religion of God does not have anything immoral in it, right? There's nothing inappropriate or irrational. So how do we justify a temporary marriage contract? This is the question. And so the objection is, what is the difference between a temporary marriage contract and fornication, adultery, or zina? In both cases, people want some quick physical pleasure, and that's it, and move on. So what's the difference? Just because somebody says a verbal statement, you're going to change that? The reality of both is the same. The consequences are the same. How is one haram, immoral, illegal, wrong, and one is halal, permissible? How is that justified? Just because the two parties, they say something, a verbal statement, it flips something from becoming immoral to moral, from something that's haram to halal? Is this possible in the religion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? This is inappropriate. So all those points that you mention about adultery, fornication, illegitimate relationships applies to the mut'ah marriage. Same thing, just because there's a temporary marriage contract does not make it right, does not make it moral. That's basically the gist of the objection. And then an extension of that is the mut'ah marriage paves the way for prostitution. There are some people who can make a living out of it, right? You charge money for it, and it's a completely legal contract and you're making money out of it. Okay, what's the difference between this and prostitution then? This is just what? A halal way of prostitution? And so a lot of people are saying we cannot accept that this is allowed by God or the religion of Islam. In fact, some Orientalists and academics have examined the Mut'ah marriage in the Shia school of thought, and they have said that the Mut'ah is a source of shame in the religion of Muhammad. You know, may God guide them for saying such statements, because it's also found in Sunni books, so they attribute it to the deen of Muhammad, which is of course the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. How do we answer this from a rational, moral, intellectual perspective? To understand this temporary contract and the role of the verbal contract, because in a temporary marriage there's a verbal contract. The wife initiates the contract, the other side, the guy, the husband, he accepts, they agree on the duration of it, and there's no fixed duration for it. They choose. Could be a day, could be a year, could be 10 years. They choose. And that makes them husband and wife, but on a temporary basis. Whenever the time ends, it ends. Without a divorce, the relationship ends. Now they could end it quicker, they can extend it, but a duration must be mentioned. To better understand this temporary contract, I would like to discuss with you the role of signatures. Look at the role of signature in society. What role does a signature have? When you apply for a visa, don't you have to sign the application at the end? When you go and cash a check at a bank, have you ever taken a check to a bank? If you don't sign that check and they don't see that it's signed, are they going to give you the money? Why? The bank teller knows you. He's seen your ID, but he won't deposit that money into your account. He won't give you that amount unless you sign it. If your signature is not on it, that's not a legal transaction. When you buy a house, you have to sign the house deed. When a president makes an executive order, he has to sign it. If it's not signed, it's not an executive order. He can come out, record himself on TV, and say the order. No, the law states we need a signature. The city council, when they issue a document, it has to be stamped or signed. Now someone could say, what's the big deal about these signatures? Why do we need them? It's just a scribbling with a pen. Really, what's a signature other than you taking a pen and scribbling? What else is it? From the outside, is it more than that? No, if you look at it from the outside, it's just scribbling on paper. So why do we make such a big deal out of it? And our society is based on it. What's the point of signatures?
It's a witness that you agree on such a statement.
It's one way to verify that you agreed. It has your mark on it, your signature, your handwriting. It's a way for you to officially accept something. See, you can unofficially say whatever you want. Make promises, do this. I will today go to the bank and cash $10,000 and give it to you. That's just a word, right? How do you make it official?
Write a check and sign it.
Write a check and sign it. That's how it becomes official. So your signature basically is evidence that you are officially accepting a transaction or doing something. And that's why our society is based on signatures. Even if it's the year 2019, we live in an advanced civilization, we still do signatures. They play an important role. Okay. The marriage contract, the temporary marriage contract between the man and the woman is a verbal signature. Now, it's highly mustahab in Islamic law to write that verbal agreement that they did, and even have witnesses. It's mustahab, it's highly recommended. But why is it not required? See, in our Shia school of thought, if you get a divorce, you have to have 2 witnesses. But if you want to get married, whether permanent or temporary, do you need witnesses?
No.
Why?
They want to make marriage easy.
See, Islam wants to make marriage easy and remove obstacles. Let's say 2 people are traveling, there's no just witness, accessible to them, and they could fall into haram. If you put a condition like that, maybe that's going to discourage some people from doing an official contract. And what happens is sometimes they fall into an immoral path. They might have a relationship still, and they can't bring witnesses. So like, okay, let's not do the marriage. But what do? They end up fornicating or committing adultery. And that's haram. Islam wanted to make marriage easy for people to get married. If they want to have a relationship, have a halal relationship, have a legitimate relationship. So imposing two witnesses was not appropriate. Makes things difficult for people. Yes, with divorce you need two witnesses because now you're ending that relationship. Allah wants to make it harder. When you want to end a relationship, end a marriage, it could affect your family, your kids. You'll have a broken family. Allah says, no, I will put conditions. I want to make it hard on you. Don't just easily get divorced. But if you want to get married, Allah says, I've made it easy for you. There's no excuse. It's easy for you. So the verbal contract that the husband and the wife, they do in the marriage contract, in the temporary marriage contract, is a verbal signature. So think of it as a signature. And a signature itself is extremely important. Now I'll share with you this example about something switching from bad to good. There's a house here next door. If you go and break into that house, just walk into it, what are you considered in the eyes of people? A thief. What if an hour before that you went to a real estate agent, you bought the house, you signed on the deed, and then you came and walked into the house? What is that now considered?
Your house.
Your house. Are you a thief? What changed? If someone doesn't know how human societies work, is like, wait a minute. An hour ago you were a thief. Now you just scribbled something on paper. It's okay. How did it change 180 degrees? How did this act of theft transform from being theft to being something that's your right? Signature. You signed on the deed, it's yours. A signature. You see how powerful a signature is? What a great impact it has. Take the same idea, apply it to the temporary marriage. Those who say, how are you changing something that's zina, that's immoral, that's fornication, that's illegitimate? With one verbal statement, it becomes halal. Yeah, that's a signature. It's a verbal signature. Today, don't you have e-signatures? Have you ever signed on an e-document? You don't sign or scribble anything. You just push buttons. Well, we have types of signatures. There's a handwritten one. There's an electronic signature. There's a verbal signature. At the time when, Islam came at a time where most people were illiterate. People didn't know even how to sign or write anything. So the verbal agreement between the husband and the wife in the marriage is a verbal signature. It's a type of signature. And that means the husband and the wife are making a commitment. I commit as your temporary husband. You commit as my temporary wife. And here's our signature. Yes, it will change something from being haram to halal, because that's the role of a signature. Just like everything else in society. Something does not belong to you. You touch it, play around with it, use it, that's theft. You sign on that transaction, you own it, it's yours. One signature flips it. The same with the verbal signature in marriage. It changes something from being haram to something that is halal. And that's why the hadith states, إِنَّمَا يُحَلِّلُ الْكَلَامِ وَيُحَرِّمُ الْكَلَامِ. The hadith states words. These words, even though you just think they're words, they can make something haram, they can make something halal. It's very simple. That's how society is, based on. So, we have to understand that we are created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we're Allah's slaves, and He owns us, including our bodies, including our right to intimacy. Allah is the one who owns us. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has said, look, if you want to be intimate with someone else, I don't allow it, except within certain conditions. If these conditions are met, then I consider it lawful. I give you that right. I own you, I give you that right. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has designated what's lawful, what's not lawful. And Allah says, if there's a verbal signature, I accept that. Because you're making an official commitment. You're not just playing around. It's an official commitment. Regardless of what your intention is with this marriage, the point is, it's an official commitment. Just like the signature. They don't care what your intention is in buying that house. You want to rent it, you want to live in it, you want to invest it, you want to demolish it. They don't care. As long as the signature is there, like, okay, legally it's yours, do whatever you want with it. The same with the temporary marriage contract. Allah has recognized that if there is a signature, it becomes lawful to you because now it's official. Now that it's official, you recognize there are rights from both sides. Now it's lawful. Now it's moral. It's no longer immoral. 5 minutes ago it was immoral because there was no verbal signature. So it was fornication, it was zina. But now it's normal. Now it's legal. Remember, we're talking about just the idea of the temporary marriage. We're not talking about the application of it. Some people misuse it, abuse it. That's a different story. We'll talk about that later. This is just the basic concept of it. So yes, words and statements, verbal signatures, they have a huge impact. You can start a war with a few words, can't you? Someone could say it's just a word. Yeah, it's a word, but it has real life consequences. How many of you remember the issue with Obama when he was doing his oath? When he was sworn in as the president of the US and he had to take the oath, the judge or the person who was doing the oath with him, he dropped out his middle name. He said Barack Obama. Whereas his name was Barack Hussein Obama. So Obama had to correct it. It was like Barack Hussein Obama. But the judge, what did he say? I'm swearing in Barack Obama. Do you know that Obama went later, privately they redid the oath when it was brought to their attention that you dropped the middle name? Now someone could say, come on, big deal, who cares? It's just a word. We leave it out, we put it in, who cares? You're sworn in as the president. No, the president cared. A lot of people said, no, that is very important. That word must be pronounced to make sure that he is the legitimate president of the US. It's just a word. Yeah, words really do matter. It is a big deal. So, what are your thoughts on that? Because remember, in our classes we have discussions. So I want to hear counter arguments about this particular point. Remember, there are many points about this discussion. We'll examine them step by step. But let me know your thoughts about this particular point. Yes?
I've heard that women, they're supposed to be divorced if they want to do a contract with a man, but a man doesn't have to.
Okay, so in Islamic law, when it comes to marriage, whether permanent or temporary marriage, any type of marriage, the woman must not be in another marriage contract with a man. She must be, in other words, single. If she's already in another marriage contract, she's the wife of another person, Islam does not allow her to have two husbands at the same time. Whether permanent husbands or temporary husbands, it doesn't matter. This is something that Islam outlawed. Whereas a man, in certain circumstances, yes, he can be in a relationship with multiple women. With the permanent marriage, up to 4, as the Holy Quran mentions. But remember, there are conditions. We do talk about them in Islamic law, family law. What are the conditions? And yes, there are some people who may abuse that. But when it comes to the man, Islam did recognize that he could be in a relationship legally with a number of women for particular reasons that we discuss, in Islamic law or in the biography of the Prophet. We talk about why the Prophet had multiple wives. We discuss the rationale behind it. But for a woman, Islam did not allow that. Now why? One could ask why. This in itself is a detailed discussion and it has multiple dimensions. I'll just mention to you a practical dimension that existed in the past. In the past, and even until today, one's ancestry and lineage and biological status is very important. Who's your father? Who's your mother? There are laws that apply to you based on your status in a family, based on who your parents are. Now, if a woman were to marry multiple men, then we could not distinguish if she becomes pregnant and she delivers. We could not tell the child who his father is. Yes, we know the mother, she gave birth, but who is the father? First husband, fifth husband, fourth husband, who? And that would obscure the lineage of the child. So he grows up not knowing who his father is. Now, historically, there was no testing, no way to figure that out with 100% accuracy. Even today, my dear brothers and sisters, yes, today we do have DNA testing, but let me ask you, there are 7 billion people on earth. How many of them have access to these types of DNA tests? Really, 90% of the people don't have access. Yeah, if you're rich and you live in the US, you can afford it. But the people living in India, China, Bangladesh, most of them, people in Africa, you think they have the luxury of DNA testing? People barely have access to healthcare, let alone go and do a fancy DNA testing. It's not practical. And Islam is a religion for all. When Allah puts a law, Allah considers the overall state of humans. Yeah, maybe 5% of people can figure that out through a DNA testing, which what? Happened in recent history. Islam has been existing for 400 years. So one reason why Islam did not allow a woman to be in a relationship with multiple men is because of the issue of lineage. That's one reason, by the way. There are many other reasons. There's biological reasons, there's psychological reasons, there's social reasons. That's not our discussion now. But one practical reason was this. Whereas if a man has multiple wives, right, within the conditions, of course, then the lineage is known. He's the father and these are the kids. And so we don't have a problem from that aspect. So yes, Islam does recognize a man being in a legitimate relationship with more than one wife, but it does not recognize the opposite scenario for a number of reasons. This is one of those reasons. Any follow-up questions on that?
I think what I have an issue with is that men, they don't have to be in I talked to a sheikh about it, and he said that men, they don't have to have previous marriages in order to do a contract.
Okay, so
but women have to.
Okay, so I'll get to this point just in a few minutes. If the woman was never married before, if the girl is virgin, then what is the law about that? I'll get to that in a couple of minutes. Yes.
The relation between a man and especially boyfriend, girlfriend in our society, is that also considered lawful? Because they have a contract, verbal contract. They're not stated exactly the Islamic way, but there are
when it comes to marriage and divorce, scholars do defer to society. Because the concept of marriage and divorce, even though Islam has laws about it, but Islam says, we have hadiths, لِكُلِّ قَوْمٍ نِكَاحٍ. Each people have their own marriage laws, right? The Christians, maybe they go to church, and that's their way of getting married. Do we recognize that? Yes, of course. Do I go to a Christian man and you know what? You're not really married to your wife because you didn't follow my rules and, do this or that. There was no dowry or there was no witness. Like the Sunnis, they stipulate that you must have witnesses in it. No. The Prophet said people have different ways of doing their marriage and divorce. We respect that. That's fine. I'll give you another example. In our school of thought, there are conditions about divorce, right? So if a Muslim man is divorcing his Muslim wife, there are conditions. In which state he can divorce her, the issue of witnesses, so on and so forth. What about a Christian woman? Let's say a Christian woman, her husband divorces her, right? A non-Muslim woman, the husband divorces her. And then she comes and she embraces Islam, and a man wants to marry her. Can he marry her or no? Yes. Well, the argument is, she did not do the divorce according to my law, so that's not a valid divorce, you're still married. No. Islam says, if she, in her religion, in her society, did the rules properly, she got a divorce that her society recognizes as a divorce, khalas, it's a divorce. You can marry her, even though she didn't do it your way. Because each people, each country, each nation, they have their own divorce and marriage protocol. We respect that, that's fine.
Yeah, that's boyfriend.
Okay, so scholars will say, when it comes to cohabitation, today we have a concept called cohabiting, right? Whether it's boyfriend, girlfriend, or just people cohabiting. They don't officially go and do a marriage ceremony, but they live like husband and wife. They rent an apartment together, they work together, they just live together. It's called cohabitation. Okay. Is this marriage or not? Scholars will say, ask your society. If society says, yeah, that's clearly a type of marriage, then a lot of scholars are willing to consider it marriage. But if society is doubtful, like we don't know, it's not clear what this is, as long as it's not clear, then no, we cannot consider it marriage. So there are scholars who say people who live with each other on a long-term basis, they move in together, they work together, they even get a joint bank account, right? If it's to that point and society says, okay, you guys are in some type of marriage, maybe you don't call it an official marriage or a wedding, but let's face it, you guys are living like husband and wife, and you're committing to one another, and you act like husband and wife, right? How do married people live? You live just like them. If you have children, they're your children. If one of them becomes disloyal and cheats, the other person will feel betrayed just like a husband feels betrayed, just like a wife feels betrayed, right? They just live like husband and wife. If that is the case, then yes, a lot of scholars are willing to consider that a marriage. Call it a temporary marriage, call it a type of marriage. For those people, yeah. See, in our school of thought, if you're a Muslim, you have to go by the Muslim rules. If you want to be in a relationship like that, do that verbal signature, as we said. But if others don't have, the idea of a mut'ah marriage, but basically what they're doing resembles a marriage, and society considers it like a marriage, then it is a marriage.
It all goes back to their intentions. Like, my intention is to live with this woman probably for that.
See, it's their intention and also the waqi' too, like the outside reality. They're living together like husband and wife. So their intention matches with what they're doing. Yeah, we can recognize that as a marriage. In fact, some scholars even call that a nikah al-mu'atati. If you go and you want to look at the legal discussion, look up this term. They do discuss that, whether this is a marriage or not. Now, if it's just a boyfriend, girlfriend in high school, college, it's blurry. It's not clear. Some people could say, okay, it's like a temporary marriage contract. Some people say it's not that clear. So if it's not clear, we cannot consider it a marriage. If society one day says, yeah, that's clear, that's just like it's a marriage contract, but it's temporary, right? They're just living like husband and wife on a temporary basis. So, keep that in mind, that society does determine some of these things.
Don't they have to verbally say it though, considering?
Who? Those non-Muslims? Well, it depends on their culture. See, in Islam commanded us to verbally write it or say it. But in their culture, if they're like, you know what, I don't need a verbal statement. As long as I make a commitment, we make a verbal commitment. And, I don't need to say I marry you on a temporary basis, but I make a commitment, we're going to live together for at least 5 years. See, that in itself is a contract. It's kind of like a signature, verbal signature. It's a form of commitment. Let's live together 5 years, let's go looking for an apartment. Let's live together as partners. So yes, some scholars will recognize this as a temporary marriage.
As a Muslim, I can go to a Christian woman and say that let's live for 3 years without saying the exact verbal marriage. Is that still considered temporary marriage? So now Muslim...
Right. Scholars are split on this. Yeah, scholars are split. Some say you need to say the contract. Some say no, as long as your intention is a temporary legal relationship with some commitment. Remember, the mut'ah marriage comes with commitments. Your husband and wife. If you have children, those are your full children. If someone is in a mut'ah relationship and they have children, what are these children considered in Islamic law? They're your full children. There's no difference between them and children from a permanent marriage. See, that itself has obligations. She's your wife, there are obligations. And we'll talk about some other details, inheritance and some other aspects of whether this applies to the temporary marriage or not. So the point is, it's a signature. It's a verbal signature. And yes, a signature can flip something from being illegal to legal. Don't we have that in our society? Take the same concept and apply it to this. I think many Muslims who attack the Shia school of thought, for this, misunderstand this point. The legal contract, the marriage, contract, make something official in Islam. Once it's official, it becomes lawful. And Allah recognizes it. And so the person is not doing something immoral from that aspect. No, it's something moral in the religion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So from this aspect, do you find any problem with this concept of a temporary marriage and of the verbal signature? Is this something immoral, inappropriate, something wrong that God's religion should have no room from? From this aspect, remember, we break down the discussion into numerous steps. We'll talk about some other aspects. Because I know in your mind, you're thinking, okay, some people abuse this, misuse this. That's a different issue. There's nothing on earth that people don't abuse, by the way. Money, power, everything, people abuse it. Doesn't make that thing necessarily bad. Permanent marriages. There's no abuse in permanent marriages? You don't know people who are in an abusive relationship? Does that make marriage bad? No. People abuse everything. So don't think of it from that aspect. From an academic aspect, let me know if there's a problem in your mind or a misconception or an objection about this verbal signature that we mentioned. Or it makes sense to you.
That's clear, it makes sense.
It makes sense, Sayed.
Yes.
So just that sentence or those words, it becomes halal.
Yes. Just like that pen and the scribble as the example that we gave makes everything legal. Yeah, same concept. Of course, remember there are conditions.
Can she be, like you said, a virgin?
We'll talk about that. Remember, right now I'm not discussing the detailed conditions yet.
Is it like a real marriage? You need like a sheikh and witnesses?
We'll talk about that. We'll talk about that. So, aside from the conditions we can discuss, but the concept itself, do you find problematic? The concept itself. Okay. So the concept itself makes sense. And if you do have a problem with it, let me know. And another important aspect before I examine this point that you raised is that the reason why one of the reasons why Islam recognized the temporary marriage contract is to regulate sexuality. What do I mean by that? See, we also have to be realistic and know statistics in society to understand these religious rulings. A permanent marriage, the marriage that people have, doesn't always work. There are challenges, and you find, one of the partners, usually the male, stepping outside those boundaries and having extramarital affairs. Here in the US, infidelity rates are super, super high. According to some studies, sometimes they're as high as 73%. That means 73% of married men here in the US, in a country that considers a second wife illegal, does not recognize it, Christian law does not recognize it. Just keep that in mind with all these things against this. It's not like a society says, yeah, go marry any number of women that you want. No. A society frowns upon it. If you're a politician, you're a respected person, and this is known, they consider that as a scandal. And this could affect you. Except if the person is the president, they could get away with whatever they want. But for the other persons in society, that could take them down. Right? Remember, Clinton was almost impeached for this. Impeached. But the statistics show 73% of men in the US have, at one point in their life, extramarital relationships. That's the reality of what's happening. Now, Islam recognizes that these challenges do happen. So Islam wanted to regulate sexuality because you have to regulate everything. See, everything in society is regulated. Buying and selling, isn't it regulated? Can you buy whatever you want, sell whatever you want? No. There are restricted items, there are conditions, there are terms and conditions. Everything in society basically is regulated. And the point is, why is that the government regulates this? To protect your rights, to make sure that what's being sold is not harmful, it's approved. If it's a food, it's FDA approved, whatever, right? There's a point behind that. Now, one of the most important aspects of humans is their sexuality. And that must also be regulated to make sure that they're following the appropriate rules, that there are conditions that are being met. If Islam says, okay, just a permanent marriage, nothing. Well, the reality is 73% of men are not sticking to that. So you have to have some sort of regulation for that. So that even if they do have extramarital affairs, at least it's with conditions. It's not something that they decide. At least religion steps in and says, okay, in certain conditions, be monogamous, But the reality is people probably won't stick to that at one point in their lifetime. If that must happen, then at least there's conditions. So you don't cause harm in society more than you would normally cause harm. With those conditions, you kind of regulate it. So Islam wants to regulate it so that people at least treat it with respect, treat it with caution, and they have a sense of responsibility.